Martin Luther's 95 Theses, Protestant Reformation. In a quiet German town called Wittenberg, a monk with a hammer prepared to challenge the most powerful institution in Europe. His name was Martin Luther, and what he nailed to that church door would change Christianity forever. The year was 1517, and Luther had 95 things he was deeply concerned about. These weren't wild rants. They were questions, protests, doubts. At the heart of his concern, the sale of indulgences, a sort of spiritual get-out-of-jail card, for money. Luther wasn't trying to start a war. He just wanted a conversation. But the printing press had other plans. Within weeks, his ideas had spread across Europe. It was like the internet, but made of paper. The church was not pleased. Luther was summoned, questioned, pressured, but he refused to recant. He famously said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." He was excommunicated, branded a heretic, but he kept writing and preaching and translating the Bible into German. His message resonated. A new branch of Christianity took root, Protestantism. But it wasn't all calm. Religious wars would erupt across Europe. Despite the chaos, Luther's protest had opened a door to faith in one's own language, to questions, to reform. It all began with 95 quiet thoughts and a hammer on a door. Sometimes revolutions begin with whispers, and history keeps listening. The Crusades' start and sack of Constantinople. It began with a speech. In the year 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd in Clermont, France. He called for a holy war, to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. He promised spiritual rewards, forgiveness of sins, honor, a cause bigger than oneself. Thousands responded. They marched east, wearing red crosses sewn to their tunics. This was the First Crusade. The journey was brutal. Many died before seeing a battlefield. Hunger, disease, and infighting took their toll. But in 1099, Jerusalem fell. The city was taken, at great cost and great violence. The Crusades didn't end there. They continued, over centuries, 8 major ones, dozens of smaller ones. But one in particular stands out, the Fourth Crusade, not for who it fought, but for who it betrayed. In 1204, instead of reaching the Holy Land, the Crusaders sacked Constantinople, the Christian capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Why? Money, politics, and a detour gone terribly wrong. They looted churches, shattered relics, stole art, and claimed it in the name of the West. Constantinople never truly recovered. It was weakened, fractured. Eventually, it fell to the Ottomans. The Crusades shaped centuries of mistrust between Christians and Muslims, between East and West, between religions and within them. What began as a spiritual call ended in greed, betrayal, and destruction. A long echo still felt today. History isn't always glorious. Sometimes it's messy and hard to look at. But we remember so we don't repeat. This was the story of the Crusades' start and the day Christians turned on Christians. In the name of faith, but also power. Henry VIII breaking with the Catholic Church. Once upon a time in England, there was a king named Henry. He loved power. He loved feasts. And he really wanted a son. But his wife, Catherine of Aragon, had only given him a daughter. Henry was not pleased. So Henry had an idea. He would ask the Pope for a divorce. But the Pope said, "No, sorry, that's not how it works." Henry was furious. So he did something drastic. He broke away from the Catholic Church, just like that. and created the Church of England. Now, Henry was the head of the church. And guess what? He granted himself a divorce. He married Anne Boleyn. She also gave him a daughter. Still, Henry wasn't done. He would marry 6 times, and eventually, he did get a son. 1. But the real impact, a religious earthquake. Catholics and Protestants split. Churches changed. Wars followed. England would never be the same. Neither would Europe. And all of it because one king didn't get the answer he wanted.
The Spanish Inquisition.
In the year 1478, something quietly terrifying began in Spain. It was called the Spanish Inquisition. It started under King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, the same royals who sent Columbus across the ocean. But back home, they had a different goal: to make Spain very Catholic. They were worried that people who had converted to Christianity weren't really sincere. So they created a special court to investigate people's faith closely. It wasn't run by the Pope, it was run by Spain, a national inquisition. At first, it focused on converted Jews, then converted Muslims, then anyone suspicious. The methods? Secret trials, anonymous witnesses, torture. People were accused of eating the wrong food, lighting candles on the wrong day, or simply being disliked. Guilt was often assumed, and confessions strongly encouraged. The punishment? Sometimes a fine, sometimes exile, and sometimes death by fire. The accused wore garments called sanbenitos, bright yellow with symbols showing their sins. It was shame made visible. Many people fled Spain, others converted in fear, and many stayed silent. Over time, the Inquisition expanded to Portugal, to Spanish colonies, even to the New World. It wasn't quick. It lasted for centuries. Centuries. And it only officially ended in 1834. By then, the world had changed, but the memory remained. Today, when people say, "No one expects the Spanish Inquisition," it's usually a joke. But in the past, it was all too real and very much expected.
Salem witch trials. In 1692, in a quiet Puritan village called Salem, fear settled in like a winter fog. A few young girls began to twitch, scream, and claim to be cursed by witches. The villagers didn't understand illness or psychology, so they blamed the devil. Soon, accusations spread like fire. Ordinary people, neighbors, friends were accused of witchcraft. The courts accepted spectral evidence, dreams, visions, and invisible spirits. 19 people were hanged. 1 man was crushed by stones. Even dogs weren't safe. 2 were executed as suspected witches. The frenzy eventually died down when the governor's wife was accused. In 1693, the trials were officially ended, but the damage was already done. Years later, jurors apologized. The government paid compensation. But the Salem witch trials remain a warning of how fear, ignorance, and rumor can override reason. Today, we remember the names of those accused, not as witches, but as victims of mass panic. And somewhere in Salem, tourists buy witch hats and souvenirs on haunted walking tours. But beneath the costumes and stories is a quiet, strange truth. This really happened. Partition of India along religious lines.
In 1947, after nearly 2 centuries of British rule, India was finally free. But independence came with a cost. The land would be divided. The line would separate Muslims and Hindus, not just in belief, but in where they could live. The man in charge of drawing the line? A British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe, who had never been to India. He was given 5 weeks to divide 175,000 villages, 88 million people, and entire histories. On August 14 and 15, India and Pakistan were born. But no one knew exactly where the borders were. And then, chaos. Millions had to leave their homes overnight. Hindus and Sikhs fled west to India. Muslims moved east and north to Pakistan. Trains arrived full and sometimes left empty, or worse. An estimated 15 million people were displaced, and nearly 1 million may have died. Neighbors turned against neighbors, villages were burned, lives were unmade. Some tried to protect one another. There were moments of compassion amid the terror. The border was called the Radcliffe Line, but for millions, it was just the Partition. It created 2 nations, but also millions of unanswered questions. Why was it rushed? Why was it drawn by someone so far away? Why did it happen this way? India and Pakistan would go to war multiple times, and the wounds of partition still ache today. But in every city, every family, stories of loss and resilience remain. Partition was not just about borders, it was about memory and forgetting. Today, people still cross those lines for weddings, for funerals, for peace. And when the world gets quiet, you can still hear the echo of footsteps from 1947.
The last, Taliban destroys Bamiyan Buddhas. In the heart of central Afghanistan lies a quiet valley called Bamiyan. For over 1,500 years, 2 giant statues of the Buddha stood here, watching the world change. They weren't just statues, they were symbols of tolerance, of art, of faith. In March of 2001, the Taliban gave the world a deadline. The Buddhas would be destroyed. Why? The Taliban called them idols, against their strict interpretation of Islam. International outrage followed. UNESCO pleaded. Historians begged. But the valley stayed silent. Then, the explosions began. Controlled blasts. Over days and nights. The Buddhas crumbled, piece by piece. 1,500 years of history erased in minutes. The empty niches remain. Hollow scars carved into the stone. What was lost wasn't just stone. It was memory, craft, and silence that had lasted longer than empires. Since then, the world has tried to remember, rebuild, reimagine. In 2015, a 3D projection briefly brought the statues back as light. But it's not the same. It's a memory, held together by hope and data. The valley is still there, still quiet, still watching. And maybe one day, the world will decide to carve again. Until then, the silence in Bamiyan speaks louder than stone.